Hello, and welcome to the DCL Learning Series. Today's webinar is titled Technology and the Life Sciences, Tool Selection, Systems Implementation, Data Migration, and Security. My name is Marianne Kalahana. I'm the VP of Marketing at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the on-demand section of our website at dataconversionlaboratory.com. Please feel free to submit questions at any time. We're going to try to save some time at the end to answer those questions. And, I just want to say that technology plays a very critical role in the life sciences. Accuracy, traceability, compliance, along with speed to market is critical. Improving content and data management, IT systems, compliance, and program management streamlines research and the drug development lifecycle. So Data Conversion Laboratory, Court Square Group, and JANA Life Sciences, we all came together to develop this learning series and address how technology can contribute to your success. This is the 6th of 7 webinars in our series. You can see the other topics listed here on this page. All of this information is on one area of our website, and we're going to push that URL out to you right now if you want to catch up on others or register for our final webinar in this series. So I am thrilled to have today's panelists here today. We have David Turner, consultant and head of partnerships at Data Conversion Laboratory, Keith Parent, CEO of Court Square Group, and Ron Nyland, president of JANA Life Sciences. Welcome so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I just want to give a real quick overview to Data Conversion Laboratory, or DCL, as we're also known. We've been in business for 40 years, and we like to say our mission is to structure the world's content. DCL services and solutions are all about converting, structuring, and enriching content and data. We are one of the leading providers of XML conversion services and an industry expert with SPL conversion for some of the world's leading global pharma companies. So if you have complex data or content challenges, we can help. So now, Keith, can you tell us a little bit about Court Square Group? Keith, are you there?
Yeah, you're on mute, sir, I think.
Yeah, there
Sorry,
we go.
guys.
Thanks.
Sorry about that. I was talking, but you saw me moving there. We are an audit-ready compliant cloud provider. We have a cloud environment that has our environment that can host multiple applications within that environment. Anything that from a life sciences perspective, all the way from preclinical, all the way through clinical into manufacturing. We do a lot of work in clinical trials, particularly around document management systems and systems for holding electronic content, specifically for regulatory submissions. So if anything like that is what's needed, we can do all of that. We also have what we call RegDocs 365, which is a qualified and validated content management solution, specifically for clinical trials and for submissions. Okay, on to the next. Ron?
Thanks, Keith. And thank you very much, Marianne, for enabling us at JANA Life Sciences to take part in this webinar series. We really appreciate it. As a company, we're 48 years old. We're third generation family owned. We basically do technical services that run this spectrum from technical documentation to the aspects of quality and compliance and operational excellence that sort of are the umbrella that overarch much of what we do. We do project and program management, and we do IT systems as well. We work with a variety of standards and formats, including XML and We have project managers at the heart of each and every project that we do. We're ISO 9001 2015 compliant, and we're currently undergoing certification for ISO 13485, which applies to medical devices. So I appreciate the chance to give you an overview, and thank you again, Marianne.
All right, well, let me pick it up from here and just kind of say again, thank you everybody for coming. You know, one of the things that we were going to be talking about today is, you know, we talked about, we're going to talk about the tool selections, we're going to talk about systems implementation, we're going to talk about data migration, all these pieces. But I wanted to kind of get into it at first by just making sure you kind of understand the perspectives of those of us who are on this call. So Ron has been in pharma for years and years and years, and actually Ron really only recently to the vendor side, right? You actually served in the life sciences on the client side for most of your career. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, I've had the good fortune to work with a variety of companies, all at the headquarters level, with Pfizer in New York, Amgen, Thousand Oaks, Genentech in South San Francisco, and Gilead Sciences, among some of the companies I've worked with.
Excellent. And then you look over here at Keith, and you know, Keith has you know, this environment where he has seen so many different pieces of technology in the pharma realm for so many years, probably more years than you're wanting to admit, right, Keith?
Yeah, we've been in business for 26 years, and you know, we started with Pfizer as the first client, you know, 26 years ago, and just over time, it's morphed into all sorts of different things that we've done, from, you know, high performance computing to electronic lab notebooks to hosting SAP HANA in the manufacturing space. So I've seen a lot of the integration aspects of pulling these things together. So the topic for today of all these things with pulling the systems together is really relevant kind of to the whole career of what we've been doing with our client base. So I'm really glad that we got to this one, and it fits really well into the overall learning series that we put together here.
Yeah, and I personally come to the table with really from the content side, right? So I've been working with structured content now for more years than I'd like to count, as well, and you know, specifically in the realms of component content management, and then also with SPL content and pharma content. And I'll also say this as we go into, yes, while this webinar today is primarily geared towards a life sciences audience, I think a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are also pretty relevant to other markets as well. And so we're not afraid to answer any questions about some other markets as well if those come up. But the way I thought we would lead into it is, you know, let's just start, before we start talking about, you know, here's the best practice for this, here's the best practice for that. Let's start by just talking about these trends. So I see a handful of trends here on this slide. Why don't you kind of pick it up from here and talk us through some of these trends and some of the things that you've seen? Sure.
You know, precision medicine is increasingly becoming the norm. If I go back in my career, like Keith, I've been in the industry longer than maybe I'd like to admit. Definitely, it's been 30 years, and having worked in global drug development with companies, but especially in my years at Genentech, where the aspect of a targeted medicine was increasingly the approach taken with biologics. Now, with genomics as just yet another example of technology, and it's the understanding of biology coming up into play, increasingly that aspect of precision medicine is going even further to just totally personalized medicine. And cellular therapy is probably one of the prime examples here. So that's happening on the scientific understanding side, but then what's happening from a regulatory and pharmacoeconomic standpoint, as well as actually it's driving this imperative. As we get more global data coming in, those analytics are serving to help the regulatory bodies around the world to understand the value propositions of medicines. So precision medicine is definitely a key component of how companies are approaching their drug development. And toward this end, the idea of an adaptive trial is really critical to help them to understand that particular subset of patients and their ability to respond and in a safe manner to product.
Mm. It's interesting, Ron, because you were talking about the precision medicine. I've seen more now with our client base doing stuff with stem cells, and I'm actually working with a number of companies now that are looking to put cell processing facilities out there, and the whole concept of chain of custody and being able to track a patient's cells all the way from pulling them in, expanding upon the number of cells that they have, and then doing something with those cells, and then sending them back to the patient is really big. And this last year, with all the COVID stuff and the adaptive trials, we've got customers that are looking to how do they change the trial midstream, because now patients can't get into the clinic and do different things, and they're incorporating Zoom or they're incorporating other technologies to help out to drive some of that. So it's really important to see, what are the tools that we select and how are we working with these customers to try to put some of these things out there.
Yeah, and
I think.
I'm sorry, Dave.
I was going to say, and I think that it's also, from a content perspective, I see things like precision medicine, and I think that, you've got a couple of problems going on here that are making you need to invest, right? You've got the increasing amount of data, more and more big data problems. And then you've also got the whole kind of paradox that, the more you personalize content, actually, the more you need to kind of standardize and make your content modular, so that you can start applying, content pieces to that. And then even looking down a little further, I think about the content and technology amongst all of this. You're having to make investments there to do this personalization, but then there's also the big piece of regulatory. We've got more and more regulatory requirements with, things like Health Canada coming on board, increasing SPOR requirements or IDMP in Europe, and on and on. So anyway, so Ron, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so just maybe going back to the aspect of cellular therapy, and what we're seeing there is this chain, if you will, of steps of extracting cells from a patient, bringing them into a facility, manufacturing them, bringing them back. And as I think Keith described it, sort of it's needle to needle. And that aspect is sort of a white glove service that's being provided by the healthcare community. It's biotech companies together with those that are providing the healthcare. It could be maybe an academic institution that is really on the cutting edge of cellular therapy. But the point I think that we need to think about is this chain of steps really need to be so well managed, but especially in terms of the validation of what's happening from one step to the next, to have total assurance that, as it goes full circle and back to the patient, that, everything has been in fact done to the rigor of the regulatory requirements and the academic institutions, ethics boards, and what have you. But, to your point, David, too, with the modularization of the information, right? Because these are very customized, if you will, trials that are happening with patients. In some ways, it's like a micronization of a protocol that has to happen, and all of those steps, and trying to do it without doing a modularization of the content is then going to make it really prohibitively difficult. So I think it's just really important for companies to think about that if they're in that domain, and for sure they are.
Yeah. Well, I think there's John.
Marion, I'm going to ask that you go ahead and go to our next slide here, so we can kind of continue this on and talk about these trends there. And Keith, you can pick up right there and then lead us into this slide too.
Sure. One thing I was going to talk about was just the fact that AI is one of the big topics here in the industry and what's going on and across the board. I'm actually on a RIM working group right now. RIM stands for Regulatory Information Management, trying to look at different systems in the regulatory world. And one of the things that, as we're putting out new specs, people were talking and said, we can't make it so FDA centric, because we think here in the US about the FDA, But realistically, to hit on your point before, David, there's so many things going on across the world. Well, one of the other things that we're doing in the RIM working group is also the AI. How does AI affect regulatory? Because right now you don't really think about it as much there. You think about it more with the big data and the analytics early on when they're trying to do high performance computing early on, looking at maybe large images or things like that, and you're pulling those things together. But they all feed in, and what's happening is there's just so much more data happening. And with the Internet of Things, we all are using wearables and doing more things as part of a clinical trial, where it's just generating more and more data to the point where people are even pulling in, weather events and things like that, how they affect people's moods and things as part of a clinical trial. So there's lots of things across the board. And if you look at just in this with the innovation in here, we're talking about real world data. How is that combined with the data about patients? Adaptive manufacturing, that's again getting back to dealing with the cells and things like that we're going to be doing. Augmented reality, I'm working with some a team out in Denver where they're actually taking the VR headsets and they're actually walking through the molecules, putting those things on. So when you start to look at some of those kind of things that are happening, there really is a lot of innovation happening now, and the data has to traverse so many different systems that's why we are a big pusher, and that's why early on in the learning series we talked about metadata and we talked about consistency of data, because it's so important to be able to use it over multiple systems like that. Ron, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, and if I look at this spectrum of innovation, and then if I layer it in my mind with the idea of blockchain, all of this information is coming together, and increasingly these pieces are being put together where there's a better understanding of what's happening with regards to not just the manufacturer of products, and those could be biopharmaceuticals or medical devices, but then the ultimate utilization and the ultimate benefit for patients. And so, these are huge data sets that are being mined, and they're being mined by different parties, but including, again, the regulatory parties to understand the true safety. With the data that's out there on the internet, if you will, right? Some of this is structured, but a lot of it is unstructured.
Yeah.
And the amount of change that's happening in being able to digest that unstructured data is so profound. And the great thing is it's giving us much more transparency into the viability of a product, its safety, its efficacy, and ultimately too the pharmacoeconomic aspects. So, but yeah, each one of these on their own are very profound, and then when taken together, I think to your point, we've seen a tsunami of data that's coming through, and the question is, how do you manage it all?
And I also think that different components are actually being looked at as data, whereas we used to just think as the numbers that came out of the SAS data sets or the data management group would hand off, and we'd be able to put tables together around a drug's efficacy or any of the number of things that we're putting tables together for. We're now also looking at the content themselves. So lots of documents are being used, and that's why AI can actually help process volumes of documents way better than just people can ever look at it that much. So that's where this innovation is really starting to take hold in the industry, particularly around things like regulatory and clinical processes.
Yeah. So we got a lot of data. We got a lot of a lot of new things to look at here in terms of bringing this in. It's leading to a lot of new systems. Which, go ahead, Marianne. I think you can go to the next slide. And what we're trying to get across is that go ahead and click to the next one too as well. There's just a ton of system types out there, and a lot of these are systems that maybe we didn't see so much in pharma just a few years ago. I mean, just lots of different kinds of content, lots of different kinds of content management systems, lots of different systems that have to work across each other, which, Marianne, go to the next one there, leads us to a crazy amount of complexity, and we start to have, all these different options and all this different functionality, and you begin to wonder, what exactly do we need? What is it we've got to have? Because meanwhile, we're trying to produce drugs, not just by IT systems here. So anyway, let's move on to the next slide, and let's get in and let's talk about some of the things that come into play. Some of the factors that come into play, some of the questions to consider, and And I'll leave it open. Well, here, we'll start with Ron again this time.
Sure. So I think when we look at systems today, they're increasingly large and increasingly complex. I mean, I don't have to tell you that. You know it, and you see it through things like Microsoft, which started at very specific applications like Word or Excel. And now today you have Office 365, which literally has dozens of applications that are running together to some degree in a woven manner where you can then get analytics on the back end business engine. But the fact is that each one of these major systems or platforms is then competing, if you will, to some degree or another with the next. For instance, if we look at the aspects of enterprise content management, this is an aspect that, increasingly companies are thinking about and trying to sort of tackle, if you will, but they've got all these different data repositories. And then the question is like, how do you get above that? And how do you sort of create a taxonomy for your organization? How do you create an understanding of the metadata so then you can bring this data together and manage it more at an enterprise level as opposed to down at that individual document level? And so it's sort of like continents shifting, if you will, or plates shifting on the globe. And then when you think of the data, it's like the water. You've got this ocean of data, but you want to create these unique data streams or data lakes, and then really to distill it so that you can analyze it and develop insights to that information to help you to understand how to go forward. So there's an aspect of then bringing these together. And in some ways, you need to migrate data and huge volumes of it. In other ways, you need to sort of homogenize your data and then seek to integrate it. And that's a huge task in and of itself that does require you to operate at a much higher level within the organization. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that many companies will have is they're trying to sort of shift, if you will, and it's a paradigm shift from individual document management to that aspect of enterprise management.
Yeah. Ron, to tag on to some of that, Ron, one of the things I was thinking about was just looking at even this one slide in front of us. When you start to think about multiple systems and how they interact together, part of the tool design that you want to look at is how are my tools going to fit together? When I look at a roadmap of the different systems we need to put in place, we know that we need certain systems at certain times when we're developing our environment. However, we want to make sure that they interact together as well. And part of that is just even on this one screen, when you talk about content management, that content management could feed into a RIM system, which then also can tie in directly with the labeling and the artwork management, because you're going to make sure that whatever's showing up on the labels for the patients tie back to the data that's in the content management and in whatever got submitted to the regulatory authorities. So all of these things kind of work hand in hand. So when you're dealing with any of these systems, you've got to think about the other departments or the other areas within the company. That's where kind of an overall strategy comes in and being able to work that out, I think, to that point. David, you were going to jump on something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to also add that, you see content management in here, whereas we used to see the term document management system. And even still, a lot of, I think, organizations are still thinking of their content just in terms of that full document format. So back to what we talked about even earlier, the whole concept of then let's break that down into the modular components. Let's think about component content management. Let's start applying metadata at those levels so we can reuse those pieces so that we can make so much more of what we've got. And again, not just to meet a regulatory requirement. I think that's been the biggest difference in our business lately with some of these systems is, companies used to look for a system where they could just store the SPL file that they submitted to the FDA. And so they didn't really care about, XML or anything. They would hire a company like us to just create that at the end, submit it, just for regulatory. But now companies, I think, are starting to think, okay, if I'm going to get a new enterprise content management system, maybe I want to start managing this where I can manage those components instead of everything just at the document level, so that I can start, maybe reusing content across a clinical trial, or so maybe I can create my own STL at the click of a button by synthesizing it together into a document. So I think that leads to a lot of a lot of the things that you're trying to pick here. What are some of the questions that if you guys sat down as a consultant, with somebody that was trying to pick a solution, what are some of the questions you might ask them, or what are some of the things that you might tell them that they need to consider as they're picking the right tools?
Well, I think some of the first questions would be whether you're looking to develop something that is on-premise, in the cloud, or a hybrid. Increasingly companies are looking to go the lightest way, i.e. the cloud. But that may or may not be the optimal solution in some cases. Obviously, that's an easy question. There's this aspect, though, of internal versus external. When you look at this sort of information that you need to manage, to what degree do you manage it internally or in collaboration with external parties? And that is something that's really critical to understand, as well as the companies they're partnering with regards to that data. And it may be a multitude of companies, and those companies today may be, let's say, a small set, but maybe in a year or two, they anticipate it being a much larger set. And I think, it's really critical to think about that, because you need to be architecting to where you have the ability to collaborate and integrate information across systems and across companies. And those companies that can do that better or best are going to have a significant competitive advantage.
Yeah. And I think also, Ron, on that point, I think that there are a lot of companies that will actually have their vendors providing the systems because they're using those systems. But then all of a sudden, when a trial is over, they have to get that data back. They don't have a system to put it back into. So now they've got to think about how am I taking that data back, whether it's trial master file data or other data that they're going to be pulling back. So that's where you really have to talk to them and say, okay, what is your overall roadmap, and what are we looking at? Who is providing what service today, and where do you want to be tomorrow? And what happens with the next trial and the next trial after that? So those are some of the questions that we get into as to where is all the data coming from and how do we integrate that stuff together?
Yeah, and you touched on one aspect here too, in terms of partners and maintaining data that's at a certain juncture. But as we know in the industry, sometimes you have a 10, 20, 25-year expectation for regulatory bodies to be able to go back and look at your data. And then the aspect of archiving that data and having it managed in a validated state is really important. And by the way, just going back to some of the basic questions, right? To what degree does this need to be validated? Who is going to do the validation? I've seen several companies even more recently get caught in a pinch where they had a presumption that a major company was going to do the validation of their system. But the fact of the matter is the onus rests with the individual companies increasingly to do these kinds of things. And that can create a little bit of a snag, if you will, in terms of being able to implement the system as quickly as one might like.
Well, honestly, I think we could probably spend an entire webinar just on this topic, but I think we do need to also talk about some of these other things. So once you've selected a tool and you've decided you're going to be moving it forward, what are some of the things that you need to think about in terms of systems implementation, systems integration, change management, example? Or actually, and here for this particular example, if you're wanting to deliver modular content to the end user, what is it you need to be thinking about?
So I think the number one thing is when you're implementing a solution, you've got to look at, first of all, how is it going to get end to end? So from the beginning all the way through the end, what are the tools that are going to be used by the end user or the series of users along the way? If it's an adaptive trial, if they're going to be using an ePro, are they going to be using a tablet? Are they going to be using iPhones, phones, smartphones? Where is the data going to be stored? If it is, to Ron's point, if it's a cloud-based or an on-premise based solution, how is the data being captured? When you're doing the implementation, are you using the proper dev, test, prod construct to be able to put things out and promote from within? To get to Ron's point earlier about validation, typically you're going to put together the user requirement specs around it, and you're going to make sure the system hits all of the requirements that you're identifying in a trace matrix to put together when you're putting that system out there. So the concept of an implementation makes sure that when the system gets implemented and you're running through your IQs, your OQs, and your PQs, you're going to want to make sure that that end user is seeing exactly what they should see based on the test plan that you put together.
So to add on to some of those thoughts that Keith was sharing there, I would say that with the complexity of the systems increasing and the multifunctionality of, if you will, of these platforms, there's this question of to what degree do you adopt the different component parts of that platform? And perhaps it does make more sense to have a phased adoption over time, where you say, you know, this has 6 different component parts to it today. Maybe in a year it may have 12. And
Marianne, flip to the next slide.
And maybe the at the outset, you know, you might be just thinking to just adopt 3 or 4 of the 6 that are available, and then, you know, in a year's time, maybe you're at the point of you know, a half dozen or more. So a phased approach is one thing that I would be advocating for. And another aspect is just the profoundness of change and change management. And often this gets overlooked. And I can tell you again, with recent examples, I've noticed that there's the tendency to focus on the shiny object, which is that software, that tool, and to get it implemented as quickly as possible. But the most critical nature of element for one to think about is the aspect of one's ability to use that system and to have reinforcement of their knowledge so that they are adherent to the system and the process. And I think, you know, the process is the key word here, really trying to understand the business process and to ensure that from a user perspective, that this system has been configured to best meet or align with the processes that the company envisions the employees utilizing. And often there's a bit of discordance here where people might say, well, that's the process, but this is the way we do it. And, you know, as you're adopting a new system, you know, it's a chance to sort of clean house, if you will, and get those things in order and to align the technical documentation with the way, in fact, the systems will be operating. And so your standard operating procedures and your work instructions, I think, are something that are also overlooked with the implementation and change management.
Yeah, Mary Ann, if you could go to that next slide on change management, I definitely want to hit on this in a little deeper perspective. You know, in my history, you know, I used to work in the technology field, and you know, it's funny if you interview people after an engagement, usually if something ever fails, they always tell you, oh, well, yeah, that product just didn't work, or this whole initiative, it was just a bad idea. But you know, from more of a consulting perspective, when you step back and you really look at these things, it seems to me most of the time when initiatives fail, it's because of a change management issue. It's because, you know, people were not, you know, were not brought on board in the right way. They were given too much at one time, or maybe they didn't get the content right. You guys have both dealt with change management a lot here. What are some of the things that you've done with both content and technology to help get users to stop pushing back and instead jump on board?
Well, I think there's 2 different things you have to think about with change management, David. One of them is change management can be an IT or a technology-related question, and then change management is also a people-related question. So 2 things that happen in both of those regards. So on the people side of things, we always try to find who is going to be the champion, or who's going to be that person who's going to be the primary person within any one department that everybody else looks up to, that works with, we work with them. So it's almost like a train the trainer type approach where that that those people are going to go to that person. So you find that internal champion to work with. And then on the technology side, when we look at technology, people hate change. There is no doubt about it. People hate change. They have, they understand what they were at. So when you first go in there, you look at, you kind of ask them, what do they do today? What are their process today? What are they going to? And you try to figure out, can I replicate something that they were using so it becomes familiar to them so it makes it easier to adopt something new? Or is it just kind of sometimes you go into these places and people just say, okay, forget it, stop using that one, we're going to start using this. And those are typically doomed to failure because people just rebel against some of those things. So when I look at technology and I look at people, I try to figure out what were they doing? How did they do it? How can we take the new system and kind of mold some of what we're doing to help them kind of ease into the new system? So that's a tack that we'll take a lot when we're doing that. Ron, how about your experience in that?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some of the very elements, the aspect of really understanding whether you have stakeholder buy-in, whether you have the champions at the different levels in the organization to affect the change. If you're talking about something that's much more enterprise level, then you need the stakeholders bought in at all levels. If it's just within a department, that's something different, right? But I think there's the aspect of understanding how much skin people have in the game. And this is where it's a very helpful exercise to go through and talk about the basics of, hey, what are we looking for in terms of those capabilities, and really to get the end users to weigh in on the user functionality. And then at the same time, to help them understand the benefits of the future state. Yes, enterprise content management is a heavy lift for an organization, but what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are people will be so much more efficient. They'll be able to develop documents with a modicum of effort. It's a 90-degree shift in terms of creating modular content, but you are able to move at Mach 3 with parallel publishing and document production if you're embracing enterprise content management. So I like the idea of reverse engineering in some ways, just getting there with the users right at the outset and say, or ask them the question, what are you looking for? If it were the ideal system, what might that look like? And help them articulate that. And that helps them to sort of understand what they may be looking for in a platform or an application.
And my 2 cents on this, I look at this and I think one of the biggest things I would focus on is the champions piece that Keith mentioned a minute ago. And, I would say champions as opposed to a champion.
Yes.
Way too often you get a single champion in a company and that person may get the whole initiative pushed through. But then if they go to another organization a year from now, you might find your implementation in trouble. So you want to really focus on developing champions so that if somebody does leave the organization, you've got somebody to pick up the mantle and run with it. And then the second part of that is a good consultant, a good outside consultant. It could be worth their weight in gold. It's just having somebody who can, first of all, bring experience from other companies that you might not be able to see, and that perspective, that bigger picture is enormous. But secondly, a lot of times they can have hard conversations. They could point out things that maybe aren't politically correct for somebody internally to point out or bring up. And so sometimes they can ask the hard questions, or they can push the hard things through with their expertise. So we all three know some good consultants in the industry. So if anybody has questions on that or wants to follow up, we can certainly talk to you about your project and hope you know some good consultants like that. So anyway, again, we could probably spend an entire session just on this one, but we need to talk about data migration now. So let's move on and let's talk about data migration. Certainly is a piece here. You've got actually just go back. I want to talk about I just want to talk about data migration by itself first before we start talking about the personalization. We do a lot of work in terms of helping people migrate data. In terms of getting their content in the right format. You've got typically a lot of issues to think about in terms of, how are you going to move this data? How are you going to get it to us? Is this going to be, FTP? Is it going to be passing as a hard drive? Is it going to be whatever? There typically are some aspects involved with, you need to digitize the data. There's a whole aspect involved with trying to analyze the data for potential reuse. As we've talked about, this idea of modular content, breaking down what used to be just documents into their component parts and then trying to reuse those. Well, you need to figure out where is there potential for reuse. So we have some tools that can help with that here at DCL. And then, also being able just to kind of understand, where it's going and what it's doing so that you can get an effective migration and make sure that you get the metadata right. Because sometimes the way the metadata is treated in one system, if you move to a similar system, even if you're moving, the same kind of formats, the metadata might be housed differently in the new system. And so you got to be thinking about that and map things appropriately. Ron, I'll go you first again here. Instead of, before we get into the whole personalization thing we're going to talk about in just a second, just in general, what are some of the best practices you would recommend in terms of data migration?
Yeah, so the first thing is to ask whether that data needs to be managed in a validated state. So I've seen some situations where people might port data from one system to another, let's say system or area, right, of information management, and it gets compromised. It's not managed in the same validated fashion, if you will. Maybe they're not controlling the access of that data, just as an example. The aspect of the chain of custody of that data needs to be just really well understood and managed. I think there's another element too, is the aspect of redundancy of data. When I work with companies and we're looking at documentation, often it's like going up into the attic. I call it the electronic attic. And you never know what you're going to find there, but you find all this, a wealth of information, but a lot of it is redundant. I know DCL have tools in terms of the harmonizer to be able to view documents and compare one vis-a-vis another to see whether it in fact is redundant or to what degree it might be redundant. So the redundancy is an element, and then there's the other dirty word called dirty data, like dirty documents, dirty data that needs to be better understood. And then decisions need to be made as to how that gets managed within the pool, if you will, of data, and whether maybe some data needs to be extracted because it doesn't meet certain standards or needs.
Yeah. Keith, you've obviously have seen a lot of systems, and I dealt with a lot of migrations. What would be some of the things you would add here?
There's a couple things that I would think about right away. One is it a one and done type migration, or is it an ongoing migration? Am I working with a CRO that's going to be a multi-year study, and every couple months we're going to be pulling data in from that group? So those are kind of things that we think about. If it's a recurring process, do we treat it a little bit differently? To Ron's point, you have to make sure that everything that we do on a migration perspective is also validated. So your validation, you have to validate the migration process and make sure that you understand that it's going to migrate the data the right way. You're checking you're looking at your checksums and all the different things you're going to do to make sure the data comes across correctly. So I think those are a couple really key areas there. One of the technology trends we talked about was AI, and AI can help out a lot in data migration, particularly if you can use some AI techniques to be able to do natural language processing of content and maybe automated metadata tagging, things like that. That's where some of those things really help out a lot when you're moving data from one system to another. Another could be based on where the source data is coming from. Do I need tools to basically take what looks like a document because somebody sends me a document, but it's really an image file because somebody scanned it in on a scanner and they never OCR'd that. So I can't see if you didn't use optical character recognition on it. It's actually not even a searchable document. You can't find the data that's on that. There's tables on it that you can't read. You can actually read it if you print it out and look at it, and if you look at it online, but when you go to search through things, you can't find it. So automatically OCRing of certain things and bringing data in and classifying that data based on what the content is. Those are tools that I see that we're starting to use a heck of a lot more within data migration, specifically to make the life easier and to clean up that data, as Ron was talking about. Take that dirty data and make it cleaner for the system that you're putting it into. So Those are huge things you have to think about. And there's lots of systems out there and lots of migration. Sometimes we even automate the migration process by having automated tools. It may automatically, as soon as people put some things into certain folders, all of a sudden it gets automatically transferred from one place to another and put into the right place. Those are some of the things that we can do as well. So in my mind, I think that that's a great place for technology to be able to help out in that regard.
If I could just add, David, just one quick other point here or two. One is the aspect of that data and its analysis. And if you are in fact migrating from perhaps one system or platform to another, at what point do you make that switch for the organization to then go from the analysis in that one system or the other, or is there an overlap between the two? And I've seen that happen in some cases for sure. And the other element here is then just going back to the aspect of having archived data managed in a fashion that's going to last through the years. If you are in fact migrating a large cube of data, let's say, and it needs to be accessible to regulatory bodies 10 or 20 years from now, there's a question of, do you have the key and the lock to get into that data? So that's something that if you're thinking about it, you need to construct that box for that cube of data to go into, so that a data scientist will be able to open it up 10 or 20 years from now and be able to sort of analyze it, if you will.
Yeah. Marianne, I want to make sure we get to the topic of blockchain today. So let's skip through this part here on this slide. I do want to just emphasize that we do have data from a multitude of sources, and that is certainly something that you've got to be thinking about when it comes in. But let's move in and let's talk a little bit about the quality and security piece of this, because I think we're seeing with all of this that the idea of quality and security is going up and up and up and up. Things aren't getting any easier. Things are happening more and more worldwide. So Keith, we'll let you go first this time. What are the big things that you think we need to think about in terms of quality and security when we're getting a new system?
Well, at this point, I think there's a couple things that we have to think about. Particularly, we talked a little bit earlier about regenerative medicine and needle-to-needle processing. If I'm going to be taking a person's cells out of their body, doing something to those cells and putting them back into their body, they're going to want to make sure that's their cells going into their own body, right? So the concept of blockchain, which was really something that kind of grew out of the financial world to track monetary, transactions, now can be used and is being used on a much more wide basis to track those kind of things within our industry. And I think that usage is going to continue to grow and continue to drive. And there's a security around the fact that that data has a chain of custody all the way through, and that's what that blockchain is going to help to provide for that. And from a security perspective around data being compromised and things like that, we within our audit-ready compliant cloud environment have to make sure that security is like one of those main tenets of everything that we do, because the last thing you want is anybody to have access in or be able to get to these things. And now that we've got many more companies working together with external partners or other vendors that they're working with, the security aspects of being able to do that with single sign-on and all the different things that we deal with is just, right to the paramount process of being able to work with these multiple companies. Ron, how about you?
Yeah, I would say that there have been track and trace capabilities that have been applied to different sectors like the food industry, and for years, right? If there's a recall on 1,000 pounds of beef, we all know about it. We hear about it in the news within 24 hours, and that sort of speaks to what's happened in some ways in the back end of things with regards to sort of the Internet of Things and sensors. The whole chain of custody of biopharmaceuticals today is being managed, tracked, and traced all the way down to understanding where pallets are moving within a few feet around the globe. But the regulatory back end of things is really what's also driving this, and it's the IDMP, the identification of medicinal product. Governments know that the pharmaceuticals are being produced in over 150 countries. And the question is, where are all these ingredients coming from? The excipients, the active pharmaceutical ingredients and whatnot. And they need to really understand that, what people are saying is going into these products are in fact just that. And so the identification of medicinal products is a global harmonization sort of effort to really understand what is being offered in a product, all the way down to enabling regulatory bodies to compare one product vis-a-vis another in terms of its whole offering, if you will, but including, again, going back to the aspect of understanding the safety and efficacy all the way down to like a milligram per milligram level for different compounds, just as an example.
Yeah. Well, I think we're also seeing the whole trend here of needing this information to combat the counterfeit drugs that are in the world. I was reading an article this week that Hindawi had put out a couple of years ago, and there was an estimate of something like 1 in 10 medicinal products in developing countries are fake, and that roughly 1 million people each year lose their lives because of falsified medicines. And being able to put this kind of security around so that kind of thing can't happen, I think is huge.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the block. Go ahead.
To that point, David, I'm working with a company out in Ireland right now that basically, a company called ProNav Clinical, that they're actually, part of their job has to be to look at the clinical supply chain for phase 1. When you're in phase 1, phase 2 trials, they've got to make sure that the companies that they're dealing with, they've got to go through and qualify all those vendors. They've got to look at the way that they're manufacturing. And if you look at the whole supply chain, they've got to qualify that whole thing and validate that whole thing before they can even think about putting a drug out there for a patient. So that's when you start to talk about quality and you start to bring in the security aspects of some of these things. There are companies out there that's what they do, and that's their goal, is to make sure before it gets to. And something in Europe that we don't have is the QP, somebody that will actually, they're the ones that are responsible for releasing those lots and making sure they can get out to different countries. And those are things that I think about when I think about the quality aspect of this.
Before we get finished, I do want to jump in and hit on that blockchain slide. I think people hear the term blockchain, and a lot of people say, "What is it?" And so I guess Ron or Keith, either one can pick up on this. Talk to us a little bit about how blockchain works in pharma and how this is going to contribute to the overall quality and security here.
Yeah, so there's a company, I'm out here in the Bay Area of California. They've been in the aspect of track and trace for several decades now. They've initially started in the food industry, but they've been in biopharmaceuticals now for the last decade. And they work in a sort of a multitude of ways, one of which is with regards to the track and trace of product going from one logistical point to another. They've got sensors that are developed that can go into containers that can understand temperature and humidity, the degree to which even the material may be disturbed or shaken. And that's just like one small component part. They've then extended their offering to focus on the idea of IDMP to then look at all the individual ingredients coming together in a pharmaceutical product, as an example, and to have that sort of ERP-like system, if you will, that helps a manufacturer to understand the whole chain of procuring those ingredients and then ultimately dispensing them. But this is just one of many companies that are out there. And it's just sort of another factor in the Rubik's cube, if you will, that we're trying to solve. Of okay, we need processes and systems, and blockchain is definitely one of the most critical component parts, and it may drive more of the discussions going forward as to platforms of consideration. earlier on, I was talking about, hey, is it an open or closed system? Maybe it's more like, does this fit into the blockchain or not? You know? Anyway.
Keith, anything to add?
No, I just think that I'm getting asked more and more about it. I think that, some of the other systems that we have out there, that they don't have it built in. It's not something that you see that often in some of the systems. But the more we get down to focusing in on the patients, or focusing in on that track and trace, as Ron was talking about, you're seeing it incorporated almost daily in new technology. So I think it's going to be something we're all going to have to learn a lot more about going forward, because it's here to stay.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we're about to move into some closing thoughts here. We did get a couple of questions. I think we have time for one here. So we'll throw it out here. And Keith, I'll go to you first, and then Ron, you can chime in after him. But the question is, which comes first, the shiny object or a content/data strategy and implementation? That is, do you buy the ECM first and then deal with the content, or vice versa?
So there's a couple answers to that. One is, it depends on the senior team and how much they like the shiny object. And typically they'll bring the shiny object in, and then you're stuck with kind of developing a strategy around it. So I see that far too often. A lot of times you'll get senior management that comes in from someplace, and they say, oh, we had this system, let's get this one. And they bring it in, and all of a sudden the rest of the group has to figure out how to work with it. In my mind, it always comes with the strategy first, laying out that strategy, identifying what it is you're trying to do, and then looking at your requirements and going from requirements forward. If you do this, the shiny object, then basically what you do is you build around that object, and a lot of times that's where things fail. So I would always go with the strategy first, and driving the requirements first.
Ron?
Yeah, I first off would agree with pretty much everything that Keith said. There's another question that I like to ask companies, and that is, are you ready for this? Because, it's easy to think that the solution resides in a new tool, or maybe sort of a new approach like enterprise content management. I think there's the question, though, as to whether the business is ready for it. In some ways, systems are often thought of and presented to the business by maybe IT. Sometimes the business functions might be going to the IT group, but it's a dovetailing that has to happen. And then the question is, if it is a dovetailing, whether both sides of the drawer are ready to do it. And the reality is, sometimes the business isn't ready to do it. There may be pressing regulatory filings, as an example, or major studies coming up, and maybe the organization's growing by leaps and bounds and they don't have the resources. So that's, if I go back to David's point earlier, it's nice to bring in other parties, and not to pitch too hard here, but if you can't do it within, you need to supplement it. And if you feel you need to do it, having consultants may be part of the solution for sure, just to ensure that those two folds of the drawer come together and they don't collapse, if you will, because one is bringing in more pressure, more resources, more capability, more desire than the other.
And Ron, sometimes you may want to bring in those outside parties, not to do the new work, but to do the old work so that you can do the new work, so that your people can free up their time to do the new stuff. So somebody else will outsource or have somebody else doing the stuff you were doing specifically, so you can embrace the change and bring in that change management we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there, Keith. I mean, technological revolution is here. And the fact of the matter is, people in companies and those that are paid to do the engineering, the design, and the product development, they are the lifeblood of the companies. And, they're going to be the companies will be much better served if they're helping to innovate, to enable those companies to stay on more of the cutting edge. And to your point, that maybe have reserves come in and manage some of that more perhaps older work, more what might be seen as less exciting for some of these people that want that newer exposure too.
Oh, and I think that's our alarm that we have run out of time here. So I I guess with that, I need to turn it over to Marianne and let you close this out.
Thank you. So yeah, we could keep talking about this, I think, for quite a bit of time. But we will continue again on September 30th with our final webinar in this series. I do want to thank everyone who's taken time out of their day to join us. Please keep apprised of upcoming webinars in this series. You can visit dataconversionlaboratory.com/webinars. This DCEL learning series is put together for folks like you to continue this conversation around things related to content structure and markup. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you at the next event. This concludes today's program.
Thank you.